President Trump delivered a fiery and scathing attack on globalism as he returned to the rostrum at the UN General Assembly.
During his near-hour-long speech, Trump took aim at the UN, climate change and immigration, and also dismissed recognition of a Palestinian state.
Hamas has repeatedly rejected reasonable offers to make peace. Now, as if to encourage continued conflict, some of this body is seeking to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state. The rewards would be too great for Hamas terrorists for their atrocities.
For more on what President Trump said at the UN General Assembly, we're joined by Esther Brimmer, James H. Binger Senior Fellow in Global Governance, I should say, Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Brimmer. So this was Trump's first opportunity in his second term to present his vision of the world since he was laughed at 6 years ago. What does this picture of the world look like to you now? Has it changed very much? And how telling was the silence from the audience this time?
Well, first, it's good to talk to you about this speech and about the United States at the United Nations, because indeed, President Trump gave an important speech. And I would suggest that he has actually developed ideas that were present in his first administration, but he's greatly expanded them. So if you look at the first four speeches he gave during his first term at the UN, he mentioned immigration and migration. He's always been very wary of the benefits of migration. He, in this speech, doubled down on his objections and criticism of the movement of people, especially movement of people irregularly into the United States and into other countries. And so he was particularly vocal on two issues: on migration, comments to the gathered diplomats saying that their countries were being harmed by migration, and particularly by unregulated migration. And he attacked the efforts to build a green economy. Two fundamental issues. And so that, in a sense, he has been consistent in these areas, but now he's expanded his emphasis, and that his main message to the international community was that he sees the world as a world of states. He does not talk about the community amongst people beyond states. He does not, he in a sense undermines the grounds for important issues like human rights and other issues which transcend the interests of the sovereign states. He's about the power of governments, and he's about a very limited and focused understanding of culture and society. And that was on display.
Right.
That's what we heard in the speech.
Understood. Dr. Brimmer, I want to pick up that point about immigration. President Trump was touting his own policies at home and basically hammering Europe, saying its policies, and I'm going to quote him, are destroying your heritage. So talk to us about this cultural edge. I want to be careful about saying this, but President Trump almost seems to be calling for some form of a second crusades, perhaps minus the military aspects of it.
What I would say is that what we've seen in his speeches has been a call to a cultural understanding of the nation. And one of the questions is what meaning you think he actually ascribes to those comments. I thought it was interesting to note that all of his examples about irregular migration were about movement of the rest of the world into the United States, into Europe. And where I see connections between what he says domestically and internationally, again, is a narrow understanding of the richness of the societies in all of our countries. And the fact that migrants have been part of that. I mean, obviously, his own mother was an immigrant into the United States, as would have been his great-great-grandparents in the 19th century. And he has frequently provided a very narrow definition of society. And again, that is what we heard. And that is what underpins much of the changes in immigration policies. And it's interesting that we're having this conversation right after you just talked about the changes in visa policy. That is not a surprise.
Right. And Dr. Brimmer, Mr. Trump's blunt speech framed the UN as ineffective and bureaucratic, highlighting the Security Council's deadlocks due to veto powers. I mean, to what extent are these criticisms valid, and how realistic is it to expect the UN to reform or overcome these structural challenges?
Well, first, I think that one has to define what you mean by the United Nations. And in his terms, he was very general. He did not differentiate between, for example, the challenges and divisions on the Security Council versus the challenges in the General Assembly versus the role of the technical agencies that are part of the United Nations system. They're very different parts of the system that he could have commented on. I was saying particularly that the ability of the Security Council to function is determined by the behavior of, particularly of its 5 permanent members, including the United States. And so that having active diplomacy at the UN, Geneva, Vienna, across the multilateral system makes a difference, and makes a difference in terms of what these multilateral bodies can do. It is interesting, though, that if on a particular topic he has a particular interest, then he will say something favorable about a multilateral agreement. So in the middle of all of this discussion, he did mention, of all things, the Biological Weapons Convention. And that is because he wants to have more rules about scientific discovery with biological agents. He mentions the COVID-19 vaccine. He mentions the COVID-19 disease and its spread, which he would argue was from a laboratory. And so on this one narrow point, he brings up an international convention and working with international authorities on that. So it's very interesting to see when he's willing to use the international system.
Okay, so Dr. Brimmer, we put all of this together. What do you think it means for the UN going forward? Are we looking at further funding cuts and budget shortfalls? Are we looking at specific injections from the Trump administration, as it sees fit, or where it's worthy in his view?
I think we will continue to see significant budgetary constraints. That there's always a structural issue in that the United States pays 25% of its peacekeeping, even though it's assessed at a higher rate. So there's already a structural discrepancy. And I would expect to continue to see constraints on U.S. funding to United Nations agencies. Of course, the United States is leaving certain agencies, including the World Health Organization, so we'll see changes there. But so there'll continue to be significant budget difficulties for multilateral organizations because they will not have the resources that they've had in the past. And the United States is not the only member state that is reconsidering or recalibrating their financial contributions. Member states make both assessed and voluntary contributions. So even countries that meet their assessment may not pay the same level of voluntary contribution, and that will be financially significant for the United Nations system. That said, that on some issues, that is one of the few places you can go to build conversations across regional areas. So the United States will continue to be a member of the United Nations system itself. The new ambassador has been named. That will help, at least in terms of having a permanent ambassador sitting in New York who can be part of the diplomatic process. That at least could keep open some of the channels between Washington and New York.
Okay, Dr. Brimmer, thank you very much for your insight this morning. That was Esther Brimmer, Senior Fellow in Global Governance at Council on Foreign Relations.